Hi, and welcome back to another one of our online lectures here in History Through Film. We're going to end our unit on Eastern civilization, or at least the Japan portion of Eastern civilizations today, by looking at post-World War II Japan. We started with really looking at early Japanese culture and focusing on the samurai. The second thing we looked at with Japan was Japanese imperialism, which we saw the Japanese creating the Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere, adding land to their empire, ultimately attacking the United States at Pearl Harbor, and then we culminated that with the two atomic bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki to end World War II. We had mentioned right at the end of that lecture that the U.S. would occupy the islands of Japan until the early 1950s, and so that's what we're going to talk about here today. We have one question, one learning target that we're going to attempt to answer, and the question says, trace the development and outcome of U.S. occupation of Japan. So that's really what we're going to do here today. So let's get into this. Well, we know that after World War II, the U.S. occupied Japan. What that means is, in a way, we sort of took over without actually becoming rulers of Japan. So they call that the U.S. occupation of Japan. Basically, this was all under the control of Supreme Allied Commander Douglas MacArthur, who was in charge of the troops in the Pacific Theater in World War II. We talked about him in the previous notes. So he was chosen to supervise the occupation of Japan. Now, President Truman and Douglas MacArthur really had two main goals by doing so. Again, our purpose was not to take over Japan and make it a part of the United States, although in a way, we were trying to make it like the United States. We wanted to definitely eliminate their war potential to ensure that they couldn't try to take over East Asia again. The other thing that we tried to do, and I think we succeeded greatly at this, is turning Japan into a Western-style nation, to be pro-American. You know, you have to think about how smart this was, because we know that if you've followed history, after World War I, Germany was punished very, very harsh. And that had eventually led to World War II. Well, I think the same mistake was definitely trying to be avoided here. So instead of really punishing Japan and what they did and all the war that they created out in the Pacific, we decided, hey, let's turn them into an economic power so that we can trade with them, and that's not going to just benefit us, it's obviously going to benefit them as well. And they really didn't have a say in this. This was us demanding this of the Japanese. And this lasted from 1945 until 1952. So Japan was transformed into a democracy. You can see Douglas MacArthur here and Emperor HIROHITO. To make this happen, the U.S. sent billions of dollars in aid. Millions of people in Japan were starving, so MacArthur set up a food distribution network to help out a lot of people. So by the end of 1945, 350,000 U.S. personnel were stationed in Japan. So clearly we were there to help, but we had our own interests in the region as well, certainly helping turn them into an economic power that we could trade with. So Japan renounced war. One of the outcomes of occupation was Japan renounced war and was banned from maintaining any armed forces. They likely had small forces for defensive purposes, but they weren't allowed to have any type of standing army that could be used against another country. Japan ratified a new constitution, so they're changing their government in the process, and this was inspired by our U.S. Bill of Rights, Roosevelt's New Deal, and several liberal European constitutions. So they did a lot of research into figuring out what do we want to look like, what kind of government do we want to have. So, by losing a war, Japan's country is changing quite a bit, going from this imperialistic country that took over other places, that revered their emperor. Those kind of things are going to disappear with all of this. They passed legislation protecting workers' unions, so they were going to be very liberal in helping the people of Japan. And because of that, working conditions improved. And one of the things that's really wonderful about Japan today is it is a very economically progressive country. They have a lot of factories. They have a lot of modern technology. And so this is going to definitely pave the way for all of that to happen. Education was reorganized. Japan's well known for its education system today. So if you look at this list here, these are very positive things that come out of the Japanese losing World War II and being occupied by the United States. Now, one could argue maybe they didn't want these things. The U.S. pushed them on them, and there's some truth to that. But in the end, you can't argue with the results. And I'll show you some graphs and statistics here at the end that prove that Japan definitely improved because of this. So Japan's economic miracle, by the end of World War II and the end of the Cold War, Japan's economy soared and became the world's second largest economy. That's still mostly true today, although they have been surpassed by China. China's economy is growing in the modern world, but Japan really became an economic superpower after World War II. The U.S. provided aid out of fear that Japan's poor and unhappy population would turn to communism. Of course, if you followed American history, you know in the 1950s and 1960s, the United States was absolutely afraid of communism. And we wanted to stop it anywhere we could around the globe. And if that meant we had to spend a lot of money to do so, we would. Good news here is Japan never turned to communism. Many Japanese companies promise lifetime employment. That's pretty amazing, especially when we live in a country where we're coming out of this recession where a lot of people lost their jobs. This would sound pretty awesome to a lot of workers in just about any country. Here is a graph that shows you pretty much how amazing this transformation was. This top line here is the United States economy. And notice right here, this would be the Great Depression. We had a pretty severe dip. World War II happens into the 1950s. We have a pretty good rise, and we've been steadily rising ever since. One thing that's not represented on here, of course, is the recession of 2008, 9, and 10. But this gives you a pretty good idea of what the United States' economy has looked like. Now look at Japan. Sure, it was growing, but their heavy losses in World War II just made them plummet. And right here is when U.S. occupation began, and you can see they have been nothing but soaring ever since. In a short amount of time, they have almost matched the United States' economy. And that's pretty amazing. One of the things that really helped Japan's economy in that time was their vehicles. We made a major change in the late 60s and into the 70s from going from gas guzzlers here in the United States to these a little bit more cost-efficient, fuel-efficient vehicles that came from Japan. And that's definitely going to help their gross domestic product, which is what most economies are based on. I won't go into the ins and outs of what that means, but that's kind of how these economies are looked at, and certainly that's what the data comes from. A whole bunch of Japanese companies started in that time that are still popular and significant today. Obviously, you can look at all the different automobile manufacturers: Nintendo, Sharp, Sony, Hitachi, Canon. I would imagine you look around your homes and you've got multiple products from these different companies. You might own cars or ATVs or something from some of these companies as well. And that's helped Japan's economy grow and soar. If you look today, this is from 2014. The U.S. has the world's largest economy, Japan being second on the list. China being second on the list, Japan being third. Like I said, China has kind of skyrocketed. And a lot of people think China will surpass the U.S. someday. Does that really matter? No, not necessarily, but they have the most workers, they have the most people, so they should definitely have one of the highest economies in the world. But here you can see Japan sitting number 3. So they're still their economy is still pretty big, and it owes everything to U.S. occupation. You can see modern Tokyo, very, very modern city. I've been told it's a very, very safe city. You can walk down just about any alley at any time of the night and feel safe. Pretty remarkable given where they were less than 100 years ago. And I'll finish with this. Here is a look at defense spending in 2013. Clearly, the United States spends more money on defense than anybody else. And you'd think, well, Japan, they were told not to have a standing army. They chose not to be a war-creating machine once the U.S. occupied. But because their economy is good, they are still ranked in the top 5 here in defense budgets in the world. So Japan still does have the capability to provide weapons and defense if they ever need it. So that has changed a little bit since MacArthur was there. All right, that's going to wrap it up for us. So that'll bring you up to the modern time for Japan. That's going to end our little part of this unit on Japan. Hope you learned something. We'll talk to you next time.